At Five Star Bank, community is at the heart of what we do. Every day we strive to have thoughtful solutions for our customers and help our communities prosper. Honest dialogue about the issues affecting the region is vitally important to that prosperity. We are proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
The recent information disclosures of Edward Snowden and the case of Julian Assange of WikiLeaks have focused the nation even more intently on the issue of homeland security and its relationship to domestic surveillance, government transparency, and civil liberties. Fundamental questions of what lengths government should go in protecting us from potential terrorist attacks and what freedoms we are willing to surrender in the process go to the essence of our principles and our traditions as a nation. Joining us today to discuss the controversy is Hani Fakhouri, staff attorney with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and John Sims, professor with University of the Pacific's McGeorge School of Law. So gentlemen, what is it that the American people should be worried about concerning these disclosures?
Well, really, there's a number of things that people should be worried about. The first is the breadth of the surveillance that is happening across the board. We're talking about revelations that have indicated there's currently a program in place that captures phone call metadata, which is basically all of the routing information about your phone calls. There's evidence that suggests there's a program that captures electronic communications metadata, so that would be information about your emails.
Let's deal with the definition. What exactly is metadata?
So metadata refers generally to the information about your communications. So for a phone call, for example, that would be the phone number you dialed, the phone number that dials you, the time you placed a phone call, the time you received a phone call, where you were potentially when you placed or received that phone call, how long you talked. And those records are basically records going back weeks and months of time. In essence, it paints a very revealing portrait about who you're communicating with and through what patterns.
Professor Sims, I want to go back to first principles. Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable seizures and searches shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, the persons, or the things to be seized. What's changed?
Well, what's changed, of course, is technology. So, I mean, the principle, even the Fourth Amendment linguistically is difficult because, of course, you've got to talk about warrants and, you know, how you need probable cause to get a warrant. It doesn't exactly say when you need a warrant. And, of course, the Supreme Court has basically, first of all, complicated things by saying there are a lot of situations, like certain kinds of emergencies, where you don't need a warrant in the first place. The next problem is that with current technology, you have a lot of issues about what it is that constitutes a search.
Give us an example.
Well, like intercepting or recording a conversation. Is that a search or not? Well, eventually the Supreme Court has accepted the idea that it is, but as along the lines of what Hani was discussing, the Supreme Court has also, I think without really thinking about it too much, and I think wrongly, has concluded that when you deal with your bank or your internet service provider, the idea is that because you're sharing information with them, such as who you're calling or even what you're paying, right, that then you don't have any expectation of privacy, and therefore if the government goes to the provider and says, please give us all of Scott's records, that's not a search.
Now, is this a phenomenon because of moving from paper to electronics? Is this part of what drives this? Because essentially what it sounds like you're saying is we're safer sending a letter through the postal service and protecting our privacy than using email or the internet.
I think that's part of it. I think, as Professor Sims was talking about, technology and the law are not keeping pace with each other. So as the technology has advanced, The law hasn't kept up to reflect the fact that communication happens more quickly, that companies store far more types of information about us for longer periods of time. So as Professor Sims was talking about, when the Supreme Court said in the 1970s that you don't have an expectation of privacy in the phone number you dialed, they were talking about a very small, discrete piece of information. Well, unfortunately, what's happened is the government has taken that rationale and used it and extended it to cover situations that certainly weren't imaginable in the 1970s. Now they're using it to justify broad seizures of email, internet communications that just weren't at play in the 1970s.
After Watergate, there was a committee chaired by a senator named Frank Church, which established FISA.
Well, it exposed intelligence community abuses across the board, including electronic surveillance, and then that eventually, several years later, along with other developments in terms of court cases, led to the adoption of FISA. So it's almost like it's a member of the family now, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, from 1978, and then it's been amended repeatedly since then.
But back during those hearings, Watergate was such a national outrage, and that the movement after coming out of Watergate by the Church Committee and other places was for greater transparency and greater protections. Was 9/11 and the Patriot Act and all of those changes that came within the wake of 9/11, was that sort of a singular event, or in fact have the concerns that you both raise been sort of moving forward on their own pace since that time because of advances in regular society?
Well, the changes have been going on incrementally and constantly all along. I mean, the whole idea that when we started communicating by telephone, then you could have an interception of a telephone call. Well, that wasn't something that was an issue before. The Supreme Court had a hard time initially deciding that even intercepting a telephone call was a search, although they eventually got there. But then you do have these discontinuities, these huge developments. Certainly Watergate and the Church Committee were a major episode. Then we have FISA and other things to respond to that. Then you've got the Iran-Contra affair, which shows that congressional oversight of the intelligence community actually is not working the way it's supposed to be working. 9/11 is another huge discontinuity. So all of a sudden, whatever the other changes are that are going on, you've got a huge change in political reality and in perception about what needs to be done.
But isn't the government in kind of a no-win situation? On the one hand, the expectation is that no terrorist event to take place on U.S. soil. And the Boston bombings of last year notwithstanding, the government has done a pretty good job since 9/11 in protecting the homeland. So on the one hand, the American people want security, which comes at a cost, but on the other hand, we're outraged because of the fact that, in fact, some have said that the government is merely using the abilities that the private sector uses every day to harvest information from consumers. What's the difference?
Well, the first thing is the Fourth Amendment specifically applies to the government to preclude them from doing this sort of large-scale data mining, if you will, or this large-scale collection of information about everyday Americans' activities. And the second thing to keep in mind is that while security is absolutely an important consideration, there has to be a balance that's struck between security and privacy. And in fact, FISA and the FISA court, which basically is supposed to review determinations of when surveillance is authorized and not authorized, was intended to create that balance, to give the government some rules to play by.
But does that balance exist, that in the entire history of the FISA court, less than 10 times has the court ever ruled against an information request?
Well, what we know is that the FISA court has not been a very good overseer of what the government is doing, partly because they've tended to sign off on what the government is doing, partly because the proceedings in those courts are not adversarial proceedings. It's the government and the court, and there's no opposing party there. And so, in a sense, they're a little bit of a rubber stamp. But again, going back to the fundamental principle that there has to be a balance struck, what these recent revelations have shown is that you know, even if we accept that the FISA court process is an adequate safeguard and check, even that provision, those parts of the law, there's strong suggestion that the government is even straying from what the requirements of FISA specifically say. And so when we're in a situation like that, where the rule of law is being constantly ignored or ignored, we have a real problem with, you know, what we're trying to safeguard in the first place.
And I understand that, but to bring this down to a fundamental base level, Professor Sims, you're a professor of law. Your students are going to emerge and they're going to take their place in adjudicating and administering the law throughout not only this region but throughout the United States. Why should everyday citizens care? How does it matter to us?
Well, I mean, going beyond the discussion of the FISA court, most of what Mr. Snowden has revealed relates to processes that never go to court at all. So there's, you know, FISA involves very technical definitions of what constitutes electronic surveillance. If it's not electronic surveillance, then you don't need to go to the FISA court to get a warrant. And so all these transactional records or metadata that we're talking about, that's not generally gotten. Sometimes it's gotten with a warrant from the FISA court, but a lot of times it's just a letter or it's just a voluntary turnover. So, I mean, I think the reality is because our lives are so interconnected now with our banking and our communications online, every time we go to the coffee shop and use your phone to buy a cup of coffee, obviously that says where you are. All of that means that in some ways we're potentially exposed to intrusion by the government in ways that we never were before. So I don't think we can put that aside, and I don't know what all the right answers are as to what procedures ought to be followed on every issue and what the government ought to be allowed to do. But I do know that we have to have this discussion. We have to talk about what the policies are.
Let's talk about some of the implications of these disclosures. One of the things that's come up recently is this whole this new name that I'd never heard before called Predictive Analytics, where it is that you're taking this metadata, Hanny, that you were describing earlier, and you're putting stuff together. And there was a very interesting example about calling patterns, because most people think that if you're not recording someone's conversation, then it's all okay, because you're not really getting the content. The example from Ed Felton, who's a professor at Princeton University, was that calling patterns can reveal when we are awake and when we are asleep, our religion. If a person regularly makes no calls on the Sabbath or makes a large number of calls on Christmas Day, our work habits, our social aptitude, the number of friends we have, and even our political affiliation. And if you assume that those sorts of patterns can be assembled in these huge databases, then what Felton concludes is that, in fact, you can essentially deduce the essence of every individual that there is data stored for. Reaction?
Well, of course, what you're talking about is a dramatic increase in the extent of this activity, but plainly this has been going on for decades. I mean, that's what advertising is about. It's deciding if I'm watching this television show, then I'm likely to have certain characteristics. Maybe I'm more likely to buy certain kinds of books than people who are watching other kinds of television shows. And of course what's happened is as we've gone online, the amount of data is increased, the ability to manipulate it and collect it and figure out what it means has increased. And of course, as we've discussed, initially a lot of that data is not held by the government, but then the regulations that are applied by law and reality have to do with the extent to which the government can get into that data. So while yes, there are these predictions going on, I suppose I think there's a certain tendency to maybe make it sound like this has never gone on before, which, you know, if you read about the government surveillance in prior wars and you know, it's not that it's totally new.
No, not that it's totally new, but from the descriptions that have been shared and the disclosures that have taken place, it sounds like the equivalent, I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but Tom Cruise's movie Minority Report, or 1984, where you're guilty of Orwellian thought crime, prior to the act actually taking place. I mean, is that a ridiculous notion that we're moving in that direction?
I don't think it's that ridiculous of a notion if you think about the expansion happening in two ways. If you think of there's an expansion in the breadth of data that's available. So as people go online, as people share more information about themselves, as people walk around with miniature computers that are smartphones that are connected to the internet constantly and creating this data trail, there's more of that information being generated. And the second expansion is this expansion of how much information the government is getting, for how far back they're trying to get it, and for how many people they're trying to get it. And that's where I think we're entering a bit of an unprecedented stage, in that post 9/11, out of this desire to avoid another terrorist attack, we've in a sense let the government go, I think, a little too far. And when we talk about creating a line where there's security on one hand and privacy on the other hand, I think the solution is not to say, look, they don't get this data at all, but rather that they have to be at least a bit more targeted in who they're getting this information from, how long they're keeping the information from, and really ensuring that they're capturing information from people who they have strong reason to suspect are engaging in terrorist activities or are threats to national security. And what the real issue, at least in my opinion, is we're not seeing that narrow targeting. We're seeing a collection on a much broader scale.
Is part of the reason that it's so difficult for people to come to terms with this issue is because really it's a bit of a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue. For all of the discussion about Dick Cheney and George Bush as being the fathers of the Patriot Act post 9/11. In fact, during the Clinton era, there was a program called Carnivore and another one called Echelon that really were creatures of the national security apparatus. And now we have another Democrat in office. And so it doesn't seem that it really matters, regardless of political persuasion, in terms of this increase in data collection. It's almost the equivalent of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex updated to the 21st century, and there's a information security industrial complex.
I would agree with the sense that it transcends political affiliation. And I think, again, it goes back to this overwhelming desire to avoid another catastrophic terrorist attack, which is certainly a very compelling government interest. But the issue becomes, how are we going to let the government collect that data? And I think, the big difference between the time President Obama has been in office and the presidents before is that, President Obama was inaugurated in 2008. Well, the Apple iPhone came out in 2007. And that was really one of the first pieces of popular smartphone technology. Facebook was invented in 2004, but really didn't take off and become the social network it is today until a few years after that. So we've seen a kind of, the timing has been in favor of the current administration, where you've got not only this explosion in physical electronic technology, you've got an explosion in how people communicate online. And when you combine those two things together, we have the situation we have now, which is this large-scale collection of data that, again, is, I think, a little bit unprecedented.
Who actually protects us, Professor Sims? And I'm asking...
You protect us.
Really?
By having this discussion. Because, of course, the National Security Agency, the agency that engages in the bulk of the electronic surveillance, for a long time, NSA was jokingly referred to, but not inaccurately, as no such agency. That is, their goal was not to have anybody know they existed. And at a minimum, what the current controversies show is that we know about them. We know in general what they're doing, and we're discussing what they ought to be allowed to do and what records ought to be available. And as Hani says, even if you've got records available, when is it the government can get access to them?
Critics are saying,
when are we going to get a warrant requirement?
Right. Critics are saying, though, that these disclosures have made us less safe. What's your view?
No, I don't believe that. I think that in these hundreds of thousands of documents that have been revealed by Bradley Manning and others, Snowden, the government has a hard time actually pointing to anything that's caused a security problem. Just the way with Pentagon Papers, with Daniel Ellsberg back decades ago. He revealed thousands of pages of documents. The government never could find anything that was really a problem. What they really get worried about is that just the reminder that there is all this data collection going on causes people to engage in encryption, to be more cautious about what they reveal, maybe decide not to go on Facebook quite as much, maybe decide to turn their phone off once in a while, or maybe even take the battery out. And that makes life a little more complicated for NSA.
Well, I asked the question because Ron Wyden made a comment, senator from Oregon, made a comment recently where he said, you know, I really can't tell you what my concerns are. There's something going on, but I really can't describe it because of national security reasons. And if our elected members of Congress and the U.S. Senate can't even tell us what their concerns are, how do those concerns ever get addressed?
Well, in this case, some of them are getting addressed because Edward Snowden leaked a lot of the documents. And so now the fact that there are certain programs going on is out there in public that forces the government to respond and try and defend.
But doesn't that seem a bit surreal?
Well, it's surreal in the sense that we have a government that is obsessed with keeping much of this information under wraps that precisely as you know, you kind of hinted at is not a threat to national security. I'll give you a great example. They've kept secret the legal interpretations of the law as interpreted by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Well, under what conceivable basis could it be an interpretation of the law that does not necessarily explain the actual tactical methods or the facts of the particular investigation or reveals who the suspect that they want to use or engage in surveillance on? Just the pure interpretation of the law, how the court sees or interprets what the words of a statute mean. They've tried to keep that secret, and that's not the way a functioning democracy works.
Incidentally though, the reason that we have this information is because of whistleblowers. And while we don't have time to cover it on this show today, one of the interesting observations that many have made is that, in fact, it's not we put a lot of disincentives out there for someone to blow the whistle on anything. And the greater those demonstrations of being punished for whistleblowing, the more likely it is that we're going to get less of this type of information in the future.
Well, that's certainly the premise that the government is operating under, but I think that the Snowden leaks have demonstrated that that may not necessarily be correct. And I think that this is going to embolden, I think, more people to come forth and reveal this information. We've already seen the side effect of it, that after the Snowden leaks, we've now seen the government actually start to release information on their own.
I want to turn the conversation for a moment and talk about a slightly broader issue, and that is what this nation evolves into, given this era of technology and predictive analysis and the like. And one of the concerns that's been raised is that we're going to become less free. Writer Nat Hentoff wrote about an encounter he had with some students at a university, and he said that that there's a connection between these issues and the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment. And he said to the students, if citizens don't have basic privacies, firm protections against search and seizure of your private communications, for instance, they will be left with feeling threatened. This will make citizens increasingly concerned about what they say, what they do, and what they think. It will have the effect of constricting freedom of expression. Americans will become careful about what they say, that they not be misunderstood or misinterpreted, and then too careful about what they say that can be understood. The inevitable end of surveillance is self-censorship. One, I want to know if you agree with the premise in our last few moments. And secondly, what do you think?
Well, it's not a one-way development, because obviously a lot of the current leaks have been incredibly effective precisely because I can put something up on the internet today and it's gone, it's out there. There's no way the government can get it back. And we've seen this obviously in the Arab Spring.
But what about freedom of discourse?
Well, I mean, I think to the extent that people believe that our society now is substantially less free than it's been before during the McCarthy era or during World War I or during the Civil War. I don't know that that's true at all.
Right.
But I think we have to worry about that. We have to. That's not just going to. We're not going to preserve our freedom by assuming that everything is okay.
And we're going to have to leave it right there, gentlemen. Thank you both. Well, that's our show. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syfax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, community is at the heart of what we do. Every day we strive to have thoughtful solutions for our customers and help our communities prosper. Honest dialogue about the issues affecting the region is vitally important to that prosperity. We are proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.